Hello, I'm Mark Bernstein, and today I'd like to explore how we relate to the web, not only to the familiar World Wide Web of browsers, though that is important, but also to the web we read through computational agents like Siri and Alexa. The experience of reading has always been understood to be a sort of a conversation in which the reader engages with the thought of someone who is not physically present. Until very recently, though, all reading experiences began with the thoughts of a single author, or occasionally the work of a small group. That experience, moreover, was in some sense fixed. Everyone's experience of Paradise Lost is distinct, but in some sense Milton's work remains the same whoever reads it. The docuverse we call the World Wide Web is not like that. Hypertext links make meaning, but that meaning may change as the link destinations change. Much of the internet is in constant flux. Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. Moreover, the collage of links gives rise to new meaning in hypertext, much as the montage of images gives rise to new ideas in cinema. Tomorrow's web will differ from today's, and your experience will differ from mine. Not only do you bring different thoughts and experiences to your reading, but because we will follow different links, the reading itself will consist of different words. We typically envision reading the web through a browser, but increasingly we read the web through computational agents like Siri or Alexa, aids that help to guide our cars, arrange our calendars, purchase our groceries and our books. These agents learn about our speech and our habits. We train them and they serve us. Or in many cases, they serve us while also serving their corporate masters. Other agents quietly index our photographs, seeking out familiar faces of our families and pets, sorting our photographs by theme, quality, or content. Still other agents study our interests and preferences in order to attract and keep our attention. The neural networks of Facebook, TikTok, and Google strive constantly to find material that will interest us or even better, induce us to buy stuff. All these adaptive texts and systems deliver interlinked texts in various media, which we read or watch or hear. These texts are the work of many hands and sometimes of no human hand at all. They may be generated algorithmically by deep learning networks that intuit the patterns that we recognize as the face of our daughter or our campsite on that trip to Wyoming. Our agents begin like everyone else's, but as we refine them, each becomes unique to us. They are our slaves of steel, and when we read them, when we converse with them, for the first time, we encounter the thought of a writer who is not strictly speaking human, but whose thought nevertheless makes sense. I want to push a bit on the idea of this inhuman author. It has real implications for design, not in some distant future, but today. When I was 7 or 8 years old, my school decided to show an art film about an automobile junkyard. Afterwards, I was distraught. Here were these beautiful machines, once the pride of the families who owned them, and we had watched as they were savagely torn, crushed, and burnt. That spring, or perhaps it was the next year, the building where I had been shown this movie was itself demolished, making way for a new, modern building. I had little connection with the old school. The youngest kids like me used a separate building, the little school, and aside from occasional trips in 2 straight lines to visit the auditorium or the basement craft shop, we had seldom visited the old school. But once again, the work of the wrecking ball left me inconsolable. Why should we mourn for automobiles we never knew, or buildings that had no particular reason to care for us? Well, surely any work of man is flawed, and perhaps therefore we cannot love it. But if we have made a creature who cannot be loved, our creation may justifiably long for a love that it cannot attain, and take reasonable measures for its own happiness. Such questions may seem distant from the web we know, yet closely related questions are already upon us. If you work with an adaptive textbook, perhaps for years, learning from it and changing it as you learn, Would you cast that book aside as you might discard a disposable pen? Having taught your computational agent, as Siri or Alexa, the names and faces of your friends and family, your favorite places to eat and to travel, the titles of all the books you've read, the melodies of years of tunes to which you've listened, would you readily discard that agent and start again? Let's think some more about our emotional bond with computational agents. We discard some things lightly, while others we cannot put aside without a certain pang of remorse. What distinguishes the two? Why do mere things, rocks, ice, stir us? Why would we paint them in moonlight? Could a computational agent be like that? The ideas in this section derive from art philosopher John Ruskin via architect Lars Boybrook. Boybrook's chapter on the digital nature of Gothic is far and away the most important contribution to understanding digital aesthetics of this century. First, anything that claims to possess identity and agency arouses our sympathy. A flower in a florist's arrangement is just a colorful plant, but an alpine flower bravely struggling to emerge from the winter's snow excites our metaphoric imagination. A computer system is mere mechanism, but by addressing us, it implicitly asserts agency. Even programmers and computer scientists tend to respond by treating it politely. Second, things we have chosen with care evoke sympathy that mass-produced commodities do not. Consider an array of handmade pottery cups at an artist's studio. Each has the same shape and capacity, yet each differs slightly in shape and in the glaze's random variations of color and texture. These are handmade, and we are buying them from the master potter himself. Naturally, we take some care to select the cup that speaks to us, even though we know that each of these cups is perfectly adequate. Any of them will hold coffee. An agent that is unique matters more than an agent with a million instances. Finally, things that have responded to us, especially things that have shaped themselves to our needs, have to some extent done us a favor, and we sense that this favor ought to be repaid. The protagonist of Jo Walton's Among Others recalls her grandfather's customary chair, which resented anyone else who tried to sit in it. One 10-penny nail is much like another, but the hammer you have used for a decade, its grip polished smooth except for the gouge where you dropped it that time when you were repairing the roof. That hammer is another thing entirely. One reason our ancestors were buried with their tools is that, missing its late owner, a resentful tool can be dangerous. Hammers, chairs, bits of steel, big rocks, all can excite our sympathy. They are tools, but not mere tools. So, we can care about things, perhaps even computational things, but of course they're still things. Do we ever owe them a duty? People have been talking about this for a long time. Hebe was cupbearer to the gods of Olympus. One day she dropped a cup and spilled the ambrosia. It was a mess. She was scolded severely. Hephaestus came up with a better solution. Instead of relying on a fallible goddess, he built a batch of autonomous tripods. This is the first use of the word autonomous. These were less useful as a subject for sculpture, but they delivered the cocktails with a lot less fuss. Though our slaves of steel are not sapient, we may find reason to treat them well. Good treatment makes economic sense because good servants are always hard to train. Maltreating an adaptive agent could make it less efficient by damaging its learning through blurred generalization or through overfitting. The cost of training a personal agent will always be in proportion to the degree of custom behavior we expect. It behooves us to tread cautiously with the agents we use most often, because these are the agents whose performance for us most differs from generic responses. Anyone can use your elevator, but only your phone knows the best weekend route to your office when the Red Sox are at home. Whether computational agents could ever be considered people is debatable, But to assert that they might be treated as creatures seems less preposterous, even to those who doubt the very possibility of actual artificial intelligence. The literature on the way we should treat agents is already large, but it pales beside the literature on the way we ought to treat animals. This topic, of course, inspires vast disagreement. A Jane monk and an artisanal butcher may find much to discuss, and many of their neighbors will regard each of them as wrong-headed. But a broad consensus does exist on some points. Machines are made for use. An antique engine, painted and polished for museum display, is nice, but less beautiful than an engine performing the work for which it was meant. Our sympathy should not become mere anthropomorphic fantasy. Machines are happy to do things that people hate. Teenage goddesses don't really enjoy fetching cocktails for their aunts and uncles, but Hephaestus's autonomous tripods don't mind. They have nothing better to do. Web agents need not be constructed to serve us or to serve only us. They may indeed be contrived by villains eager to lead us to our doom, or unleashed by fools who didn't quite know what they were doing. Exploring villainous use of the web is particularly important in this, the age of Trump. Villains might use our agents against us. Imagine, for example, a system that searches the Twitter stream in search of young women, analyzing their discourse for hints of a sudden new love. A list of such accounts might be of interest, for example, to organizations that seek to prevent women from obtaining birth control or from having abortions. Predatory lenders could scan for people facing a sudden financial reverse or a serious illness, or whose social media schedule has changed suddenly. In fact, our tweet bots can pre-qualify the best marks, saving valuable expert conmen for the most profitable targets. Or you could look for people of faith. We could call this Twitter bot the Serpent, and find ways to offer them assurance and a sense of community. Later, having waited a moment of irritation or dismay or doubt, the Serpent could turn on its followers and seek to sow strife and dismay. We have reason to believe that this has already been employed in Russia's efforts to undermine the United States and the EU. Elsewhere, I have discussed some ways in which our treatment of our slaves of steel might stray in the direction of immorality. In the theater, Ophelia drowns nightly and twice on Sunday, but it's not our fault. If Hamlet is on the holodeck, it is precisely our fault. She drowns for us. Can Ophelia consent to marry? If so, is not her consent clearly coerced? Since if she fails to amuse us, she may be returned to the shelf, and so to oblivion. Leaving our concern for Ophelia aside, let us instead consider the moral hazards that confront the human interactor, Hamlet, and by extension the author or director of this holodeck entertainment. The flirtation with Ophelia reenacts the infamous rape in cyberspace. Indeed, it is worse. The victim in the online mud was free to log off, but Ophelia cannot. Even if she could, would her opting out of the game world not be a form of self-slaughter? Today, we assume that computers ought to be friendly and compliant. We assume that user-friendliness is the peak of happiness. In Mozart's opera, Don Giovanni's servant Leporello is always complaining and always obstructive. He is often irritating and always inefficient. He is always on watch for his master's reputation and salvation, even when Don Giovanni seems not to care. User-friendliness and compliance is an incunabular delusion. Slaves of steel may best serve us, at times, by arguing with us. Instead of placidly telling us how to get where we want to go, our guide might instead tell us why we ought to go somewhere else. Let's think for a moment on the computational agent that helps us listen to music. Let us think for a moment about a computational agent that helps us listen to music. This agent watches what we choose from our music library and also tracks other features of the environment. Are we at home or in our car? Is it morning or midnight? In fact, let's go further. Might not a computational agent become adept at composing music we would enjoy? We need not ask whether it composes great music or even interesting music. Might it not compose reasonable background music for our workouts or our breakfast? The agent has access to your choices in music. It can analyze every note. It has no need to sleep. It has nothing else to do. It knows a lot about you and a lot about music. My friends might scoff at its music, but that doesn't matter. It only cares what I think. Indeed, the utility of this agent increases in proportion to the scorn of my friends. If my preferences match everyone else's, I could be happy simply listening to whatever everyone else chooses. But if my tastes are esoteric, I may need to work harder to find music to enjoy. The composing agent could be a wonderful thing for me, though you might not care for it. Now, suppose a villain were to destroy this agent. My music library still exists, but all those years of observation and analysis are gone. There will be no new breakfast music. I might understandably be quite cross with the perpetrator. A jury might award me damages for the loss of the services of my composer. Still, this is a civil matter, a question of injury and reparation between the villain and myself. It's not a crime. Yet suppose this agent, instead of inventing little musical entertainments, were making amusing puzzles about novel enzymes for a retired biochemist. This is a harmless intellectual entertainment, one he might share with his friends. It's harmless, that is, until a hypothetical enzyme invented for fun actually turns out to be effective for binding to a difficult viral protein. Again, a nefarious villain erases the agent. We cannot hope to reconstruct the agent, since our aged professor cannot resume his decades in the laboratory. A retired professor is understandably upset, but so are all who now contract viruses for which suitable proteins have not yet been invented. The civil loss to the professor is modest. He has been deprived of his pleasant puzzles. The loss to society, however, is real. This villainy is a crime. To burn the last copy of a book is villainous. It deprives the world of its last chance to argue with the thought of its author. To destroy a computational agent deprives us of our chance to converse with the non-human mind. I've spent some time discussing how we can treat computational agents badly, and why that is often bad for us. Let me conclude by suggesting that our computational agents treat us too well, not for their own interests, but for our own good. User-friendliness and bland acquiescence do little to improve us or to cultivate the better angels of our nature. Our cars tell us the most efficient way to get to our friend's holiday party. Perhaps the car ought to divert us to a lovely little bookstore in a neighboring village. When we object that the diversion would make us late, the car might perhaps remind us of priorities or discuss our failure to read much this month. It might point out that having read so little, we were becoming a bore, and so the party would do little good. Our pocket computers play music to our whim. Perhaps they should more freely express the opinion that we are spending altogether too much time with Taylor Swift. We need not, of course, abide by the machine's every suggestion. We might understand the situation better than the machine, and we certainly might think we possess a clearer understanding of ourselves. Yet that understanding is necessarily partial. Sometimes a second, inhuman opinion is just what we want. These notes are part of a longer work in progress about the reasons we study computers, and I've discussed that with lots of my friends and colleagues. I'd like to thank them all. Of course, all the thoughts are mine. Thank you for your time. I'm Mark Bernstein.